Hi everyone. Today we're going to begin at the beginning by looking at what's considered to be the very first film, Monkey Shines. 1890 is the approximate date given to this work, shot and produced at the studio of inventor Thomas Alva Edison. This is the same Thomas Edison that you'll remember from high school history class, the great American inventor and, of course, Ohio native, who's credited with bringing us such things as the electric light, the phonograph, and most importantly for us in this class, the motion picture camera. He was the producer of the films that we're going to watch in this unit. His company paid for them, that is, and in this case was instrumental in actually developing and inventing the technology. But the person who we'd conventionally call the director of this film, the person who was behind the camera, making choices, was his assistant, W.K.L. Dixon. And this will be true for pretty much all of the Edison films that we see in this module. Your book goes into much greater detail on Dixon and his role in early cinema. He'll eventually leave Edison and found a rival company, the American Mutoscope Company, which will quickly surpass Edison's and create much more kind of historically and artistically important films. And as your book points out, Dixon was responsible for a lot of the major choices that affected the whole history of the cinema and are still with us today, such as slicing 70mm still camera film down the middle to make 35mm film for motion pictures. I'm going to play the film for you once through, and then we'll watch it again while I talk over it and point out some details. This is the format that we're going to maintain for these lectures, watching the clip once, then some discussion of what appears in the clip. So that was Monkey Shines. As you can see, cinema wasn't born whole. We don't see a clear image or even what we might describe as a photographic record. What appears on the screen is just barely representational. The images don't seem to hold up to any standard we might have of documentary photographic evidence. What we actually see here is rather protean. It looks like a series of white blobs that move and change shape, almost as if under the process of a kind of cellular division. These white bursts of light at moment take the shape of a silhouette or a body. As the form moves, we get the sense of it as a human body. The blob moves, we get indications, primarily by its movements. We see that it's a figure. We see an arm move away from a torso, and neck and heads appear suddenly and then disappear. Familiar gestures give us bits of momentary recognition. We see a little triangular shadow appear in the middle of a white area. We get the sense of the man's hands just raised up in prayer. As you may have noted from the title card at the beginning of the reel, this was not a typical film as we would think about it today. This was a sequence of tiny images that were animated to appear in this way. As we'll discuss a bit further on in Module 1, projected film took longer to come about. A moving image like this one would have been shown as part of an optical toy, as a spinning disc, and later films would be shown in hand-cranked single-viewer machines that were sort of like personal peep shows. But still, this early combination of photography and animation gives Monkey Shines the title of the first moving photographic image. We'll talk more about these optical toys and display devices a little later on in Module 1. I'm showing you here some stills from Monkey Shines. These would have been like the individual photographs that collectively, when animated, give us the moving picture. These stills call out into higher relief just how unintelligible each individual frame or each individual image was, and how much movement adds to our understanding of what we see. You'll note that in many of the frames we don't see a complete body, just a hovering amoeba-like shape, set off in a murky, inky background with flecks of light. Most of what we see, or rather what we think we see, is a result of the subtle changes between the frames. From one to the next we get indications of a body, a hint of a belt, and so on. These individual photographs are so poor in part because of the excessive requirements film made upon photography. As, we'll sh- as we shall see, to realistically animate a photographic image, one needed at minimum 12 frames per second, but ideally something closer to 24 or even 48 to capture motion in a way that seemed accurate and realistic. Taking images of such a short duration involved several necessary technological advancements, which we're going to discuss over the course of this lecture. But most of all, it required a lot of light. Getting huge amounts of bright sunlight onto the subject was necessary, and photographic detail in such a brief exposure, remember, just a fraction of a second, depended on it. Edison, Dixon, and their other collaborator, William Heise, rapidly improved on the process and in the control of light. I'm going to show you now Monkey Shines number 2. So it was made really soon after the original, and in this little film we see quite a bit more. I'm going to play it once through and then I'll talk over it again. So in Monkey Shines 2, we get very similar content. A man in a white shirt moving his torso. But in other respects, it's totally different. We get much clearer indications of what's happening frame by frame and overall. We can see that he's wearing a belt, he has a hat or a turban on his head, he has a mustache, he's doing this very odd, I'm a little teapot style dance. Already we see this enormous leap in clarity and content with just these images. We can understand them as photographic and representational, not just as moving. Within just a few months, Edison and Dixon make huge leaps again. In Dixon's greetings, we see W.K.L. Dixon on camera, and the difference between this film and Monkey Shines is stark. We see a man, a particular man, one who we could identify and describe, a clear photographic representation of an individual moving. We see a clear, if very simple action of him moving his hat from one hand to the other. What we get here is photography really clearly coupled with cinema. Cinema is the culmination of several inventions that needed to be put together and improved in very specific ways to make motion pictures as we've now just seen them. I've already foreshadowed the first of these, optical toys, by saying how the Monkey Shines films were not projected films, but instead were shown on optical toys, so spinning discs and drums that would animate individual images into what appeared to be a moving image. The photographic camera, of course, was needed to make cinema. We had to get photographs, and we had to get them at 24 frames per second to create the accurate illusion of cinematic movement. And so many advancements and improvements had to be made upon standard photography to get sharp images at such a rate. Photographs, still photographs, looked wonderful already at this point in time. But to get such quick exposures and to make them in such rapid sequence, that was the thing that needed to be figured out for making moving images. Photographic film, too, had to be customized for making long, continuous sequences of images rather than just isolated shots. The material had to be sturdy and flexible enough to run through cameras and projectors at a fast rate. And the illuminated projector, which had been in existence for a very long time, really for centuries, had to be customized to make crisp, large images, but also to do it safely. Early film was very flammable. And so some technological considerations needed to be made, both in terms of what film stock was going to be used and whether it would be so flammable, and how to get them to project so large. Images are tiny, right? Just a few millimeters across, really. So they have to be massively enlarged and thrown across a pretty far distance to get the large scale of the cinematic image that we are accustomed to. The perfection of the illuminated projector will quickly change film from a private viewing experience on these kind of optical devices and little kind of handheld spinning discs or peep shows into the mass spectacle that we know of it today. So we're going to spend some time talking about all of these inventions and how they added up to what we know as cinema or the movies. Let's begin with optical toys. Animation predates cinema by quite a long time. To make an animated image, one just needs a succession of images which differ just slightly from one another. While most of the animations that we see nowadays tend to come to us in a film form, that is, as drawings that have been photographed frame by frame and then played back as a film, photography and film aren't actually necessary to make an animation. We only need to think of a flip book to understand this principle, right? A flip book is a little book where you have dozens of images that are just slightly different from each other, and when you pull back the edge of the page and let them all kind of unfurl really rapidly, you see an animated image. Those devices, like flipbooks, date back at least to the 17th century and possibly much earlier. And these were really influential in helping scientists understand how film could work. In the 19th century in particular, vision scientists were experimenting with optical toys, like the flipbook, to understand how the eye and vision worked. The phenakistoscope here that I'm holding in my hands is an example of one of these toys. And it's not very easy for me to demonstrate it on camera, but I have a bunch of simulations that'll help us understand it. And it's going to give us a sense of how animation worked and thereby how film was going to work. In general, the scientific research of the 19th century focused on what's known as the persistence of vision, or what's also called retinal retention. These theories explain why, after you see a bright flash of light, that stimulus seems to hover in your vision for a little bit. Sometimes just for a small fraction of a second, or other times for quite a long while if it was a very bright light. This theory also explains why, if in a dark room I swung a flashlight in a circle, you wouldn't see a single moving point of light traveling around in the shape of a circle, but a circle drawn and hovering in space. These effects encourage scientists to research the principles behind it, and their work was fundamental in figuring out how to make animations, and by extension, how to animate a series of photographs to become cinema. So the persistence of vision is the phenomena of the eye by which an afterimage appears to persist or hover in the field of vision for a fraction of a second, even after that stimulus has been removed. This is especially effective when there's a great contrast of light, say when you're in the dark and you see a bright flash followed by darkness again. I'm sure we've all had the experience of turning on a flashlight or lighting a candle in darkness and then having that image of the light or candle follow our vision around for a while. What's really interesting here is that while research into persistence of vision catapulted film and animation forward, it actually isn't the scientific principle that creates movement in images. If it were, this would mean that what you would see previous images hovering in your field of vision, covering over the next image that replaces it. You can imagine that this would become a very blurry and layered effect. But despite the fact that persistence of vision was not the scientific cause of the perception of animated movement, it still has relevance for film theory and scholarship today, and you'll see it mentioned in the textbooks and so on. Because if only it was for so long believed to be the cause that it motivated experiments that greatly advanced the projected animated image. So it is still a theory deeply entrenched in film studies and history, even if it's not really the scientific principle that explains any of this. But it's easy to think of the camera and the film surface as a kind of persistence of vision machine, or as analogs for the eye. When we open up a camera's aperture and let light in, the longer we keep it open, the more information it retains. So someone like Pablo Picasso here in this photograph can move a light pen around, drawing the shape of a centaur, and then pausing for just a moment at the end of this quick action. And the camera catches all of this in a single image. So The now accepted cause of the apparent motion of a sequence of still images is called the phi phenomena. And the phi phenomena was discovered by a psychologist named Max Wertheimer in 1912, so pretty soon after the invention of film. The phi phenomena is an optical illusion created by a series of still images viewed in rapid succession. So rather than seeing each individual image, we perceive continuous motion. So here's a super simple animation of a black bar on a white background. I'm just toggling between two images here. One with the bar on the left and one with the bar on the right. The bar isn't moving, but our brains perceive it to move from one side of the screen to another, as if it's jumping. And if it moves really quickly, we see the images simultaneously, even though they actually aren't there simultaneously. So this has to happen at a certain speed for the illusion to work. Here's another easy illustration. Here's a circle of lights. In sequence, one light goes out at a time. This is easy to describe and understand. However, we perceive the little dark spot, that absence of light, as something racing around the edge of the circle. The dark spot isn't moving in any literal sense. We just have a sequence with slight changes, right? A light goes on or off in each of those positions. Yet the combination of the eye and mind processes this change as movement rather as discrete different states. It's this principle of the phi phenomena that actually describes how optical toys worked and why filmic motion is perceived at about 12 or 24 frames a second. So this is a thumatrope, a Greek word that means something along the lines of wonder spinner. It's essentially a disc or a card that has an image on each side. Typically it has strings attached to each end, and when one holds the string stretched out so that the disc is suspended in space between your hands and twists the string, it gets taut, and then it unfurls spinning. And the pictures on each side of the disc are related. So as you see here, in the bottom example, there's a bird on one side and a cage on the other. That's when you spin it really quickly, quick enough so that the two images appear simultaneously. The bird appears to be in the cage. And the other examples you see here, you see a man's face appears inside his empty clothes, and somewhat terrifyingly, this nasty little gargoyle is hovering over the sleeping or perhaps fainting woman. Here's a thumatrope animated so you can see more easily its effect, because it's a little hard to demonstrate through the camera. So in this, we see an image of birds, and then we see dogs lunging at them. They're separate images, but the sequence puts them together in the same moment and makes us draw a causal relationship between them. The birds are scattering because the dog is lunging. So a little narrative moment is born. Whether the sequence is fast enough to see them simultaneously or in quick succession, we'll read it as a little story. When we see this idea emerge in the next few weeks, we'll talk about editing and the juxtaposition of images in film sequences. So now back to the phenakistoscope. Its name, in ancient Greek, means something like eye deceiver. And I just want to point out a few of its features in close detail. This is a bit of an abstract or less typical one. You see a hand bouncing a basketball as it goes around the circle, and it changes ever so slightly, moving from the ball being very close to being very far removed. And you can see that the images have slight differences, and there's instructions here. It tells you to impale this on a pencil through the hole, peep through these slots here, and spin counterclockwise to observe in a mirror. And so essentially what you would do is you would put a pencil, like so, through here, spin it against the grain, and close one eye and peek through these little slots. And peeking through these little slots is really important. It's what actually allows for the effect. I can't simulate it for you here, because if I do spin it for you, it'll be mostly a blur. But for me, because I'm peeking through these little slots, I see a series of discrete images because the slot actually breaks apart my view. So rather than seeing a blur, I see them moving through in succession. So this little cutaway creates a break, and your brain perceives this break even if your eye or you can't consciously look at it. And this is what allows for the phi phenomena to have a series of sequenced images that read rather as continuous motion because of the breaks between them, that visual noise that disrupts the blurry continuous image. The phenakistoscope was invented nearly simultaneously by two different scientists in 1832, a Belgian physicist named Joseph Plateau and an Austrian professor of geometry, Simon Stamfer. You'll see in this image that rather than having the slots on the disc, the same disc as it had in the one that I just showed you, this one is attached to an opaque card with slots that you can peer through while spinning the disc with the images, and this way you don't need a mirror. Phenakistoscopes came in all sorts of patterns of changing facial expressions, of people moving or dancing, even abstract patterns or mandalas. Here's an animated simulation of a phenakistoscope in motion. Here we see a little man marching around the perimeter of a disc pushing his bicycle. In the center is a more abstract swirling pinwheel pattern. So the little slots or breaks in the phenakistoscope, or the flipping binary motion of the thaumatrope, and even the thin moving blank edge of the page of a flipbook create divisions between the images or frames that allow us to perceive continuous motion from discontinuous images. This property, this is the one that actually causes us to see a sequence of images as moving. It's called visual masking. Without it, those tiny, almost perceptible, or at least not consciously perceptible breaks wouldn't be enough for us to perceive continuous motion. This is because the persistence of vision, or retinal retention, as we were talking about earlier, would actually get in the way of perceiving motion because it can block out the other images or make everything appear blurry. To see movement, there needs to be a tiny break between the successive images so that the brain can perceive the minute differences, the subtle differences between the successive images. Each frame must be followed by a brief period of visual noise. That is a moment of no information, a dark interval or a moment of static, or the little edge of the page or the edge of the disc or the cutout spot. You can't consciously see this break, but it's there, and it's necessary for still images to appear as moving. For this motion to appear fluid and naturalistic, the images must change at least 12 times per second, but ideally more than that, 24 or more. This rate is called critical flicker fusion. It refers to how fast the images have to change or flicker to fuse into what appears to be uninterrupted continuous motion. I'm going to leave off this first lecture with a short documentary demonstrating a series of optical toys, including the phenakistoscope and a carousel-shaped toy called the zoetrope.
Inspired by Faraday's wheel, Joseph Plateau in Brussels and Simon Stampfer in Vienna invent the phenakistoscope independently of one another in 1832. Stampfer called it the stroboscope. In England, it was known as the phantoscope. This disc demonstrates continuous movement for the first time. Comparable to film because it uses minimal differences between the images to create the illusion of movement. In 1833, Horner invented the Daedaleum, later called the zoetrope or wheel of life. Here, the phases of movement are also seen in the form of an infinite loop through the slits. We see an image, then no image, and then a slightly different second image, producing the illusion of movement in the mind of the viewer. In 1877, Émile Reynaud built his praxinoscope. We see the images in the mirrors. The function of the dark phase between the slits is taken over by the angle at which the mirrors are set up.